If you have any questions, you're welcome to pop those in the chat. But just as a reminder, if you're on camera or on microphone, you will be included in that recording. So again, my name is Caitlin. If you have any questions here this evening, definitely let me know. As well, one of the things that I like to do at the start of every meeting, gathering, or presentation that we have is just take a moment to acknowledge the location of Carleton University. Carleton is located in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and also on traditional and unceded Algonquin territory. Something that's really important for us as students, as staff, and as faculty to recognize the role and responsibility that we have to play in working towards reconciliation. And I really encourage you, if you're considering Carleton or a student here, to really take a moment to take a look at what's happening at Carleton when it comes to Indigenous relations. You can head to carleton.ca/Indigenous or send us an email at indigenous@carleton.ca, and we'd love to chat about it with you. But I'm not going to take up too much time because I'm not the expert here that you're here to listen to. I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Zachary Patterson to give you a little bit more information on his research and lots of great things happening in the Department of Neuroscience. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Caitlin, for the lovely introduction and land acknowledgement. That was fantastic, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. So the idea here for me is just to kind of give you like a neuroscience 101 sneak peek at what a lecture would look like if you were to join our program. One of the courses I teach in our program is called neuropharmacology, and this is kind of the stuff that we cover, the effects of drugs on the brain and how that changes behavior or cognition, or we can address mental health issues or whatever. And so cannabis is obviously a very popular topic these days. I thought, why not give kind of a sneak peek lecture on cannabis? So that's what we're here to talk about tonight. So cannabis and mental health, what have we learned? I'll kind of give you a quick overview of the topics I'll cover this evening. So first of all, what is cannabis? It's actually a hard question to answer, as simple as it sounds. So we'll start there. What is cannabis? And we'll talk a little bit about how cannabis affects the body and the brain. We'll talk about how cannabis can produce psychological changes, so perceptual changes, cognitive changes, things like that. This is where I might sprinkle in a little bit of the work that we do, that part of my research team does. Also, I have two of my wonderful students joining us tonight, Owen and Emily. So maybe we can sprinkle in a little bit about some of the work that they're involved with too. And if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to dump your questions in the chat, or even put your hand up. I might not see it, but you can just unmute yourself and yell at me, and I'm happy to take questions at any time. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the harms associated with cannabis use, maybe dispel some myths, talk about kind of what we know and what we don't know, what remains to be understood. Okay, so getting right into it, what is cannabis? My phone's ringing. So there are three varieties of the cannabis plant: Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis ruderalis. The third one is not so relevant. It doesn't produce high levels of THC as some of the cannabinoids that a lot of people these days are interested in. And so we don't often hear about Cannabis ruderalis, but it exists. It is considered a member of the cannabis plant family. The two, I guess, most famous versions of the cannabis plant are Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica. And each of these plants, whether it's a Cannabis indica plant or a Cannabis sativa plant, contains about 400 compounds. I'd probably say that's an underestimate. We're still finding these compounds all of the time, of which at least 70 are psychoactive. So when we talk about what is cannabis, or what are the effects of cannabis on the brain, it's actually kind of a difficult question to address, because we're talking about at least 70 chemical compounds that have some form of activity on the brain. And so that is a lot of variables to try to track down and uncover. And so I would say we're kind of just scratching the surface about our understanding of what cannabis is and what is the effect it's having on our brains. So that's kind of what keeps the field interesting and new and exciting, to be honest. The most again, famous or commonly known psychoactive ingredient in the cannabis plant is called delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. Again, not the only psychoactive component, but probably the one that's most often discussed. It's the most recognized for sure. One of the reasons it's the most recognized is because it was the first one that we identified. And so we've known about it the longest, we've done the most research on it, and it's kind of the subject of conversation the most. It actually is the one that we think is leading to kind of the feelings of like being high, or like that really kind of strong psychoactive effect of the cannabis plant is thought to be mostly the responsibility of THC. Although there are other compounds that we're discovering all the time. CBD and CBN have been talked about for many, many years. And actually, if you look on the Ontario Cannabis website, for example, you'll see a lot of cannabis products that have these compounds listed, like by concentration. So THC, CBD, and CBN. Actually, Emily helped me discover this brand new cannabinol, cannabigerol CBG, which I had never heard of. And so this just goes to show people are discovering these new compounds all of the time, and so there's probably a lot more to learn on that area. But that kind of covers, what is cannabis? What are the major psychoactive components? What are the compounds that we care about the most? And that would be THC, CBD, CBN, and some of these newer ones like CBG. So I'm really interested in this question: who is using cannabis? I like to kind of take an epidemiological lens at some of these issues that we research. It's like, who's actually impacted by cannabis? Who is using cannabis the most? And so I actually updated a lot of these statistics this morning with kind of the most recent data available. It actually takes quite a long time to capture this data in at a national level and chop it all up in a way that makes sense. And so sometimes these numbers are from 2018, 2019, so pretty old numbers, but I was able to get numbers as of 2022. So that's the most recent data available. And if we look, I should mention, this is strictly through a Canadian lens. So I'm actually asking who is using cannabis in Canada. It's probably a different answer if you look internationally, and that's also very interesting. But for the sake of tonight, I'm just looking at this through a Canadian perspective. And so in Canada, it's our 16 to 24-year-olds that are mostly responsible for the majority of cannabis use. Individuals in that age range, 16 to 24, are about 2 times more likely to use cannabis than individuals that fall outside of that age range. So if you look at a 45-year-old, for example, not that they don't use cannabis, but you just polling a random 45-year-old on the street, it's like they're half as likely to be using cannabis versus if you polled someone from the ages between 16 and 24. And then just broken down a little bit more. So in this particular survey that was conducted in last year in 2022, 37% of respondents reported using cannabis in the past 30 days from the 16 to 19-year-old age group. And then another 50% reported using cannabis use from that 20 to 24-year-old age group. So really, it's our young adults in this country that are using the most cannabis. Interestingly, if I look at the, who is in our program, it's like also people in this age demographic. So I'm very interested in the effects of cannabis on academic success, for example, because I recognize that there's a lot of, my students that are, that fall right into this demographic who we know is using the most cannabis in our country. That being said, 37% of students who participated in this survey reported using cannabis. And that was more than any other category of employment. We're limited to what boxes they could tick in this survey, but essentially they could say I'm a student, or I'm full-time employed, or I'm unemployed, or I'm retired. And so if you look at all those age demographics, employment demographics, it's like students also stand out as the ones using the most cannabis in this country. The average age of initiation has actually gone up. The last time I gave a presentation similar to this, the average age was 18.7 years or something like that. And when I checked this morning, so these numbers are hot off the press, the average age of initiation is 20.5 years. This is a little bit misleading. What I think is going on here, it's not that people are waiting an extra 2 years to initiate their cannabis use, but it's that we have after legalization, we have a lot of our older adult demographic. So people that are 50, 60, 70, 80 years old, trying cannabis for the first time. And so they're really kind of skewing those numbers up a little bit. That's what I think is going on. the data tells us that the average age of initiation is 20.5, so we have to listen to that data, but I would say it's probably skewed with a lot more older adults in the last couple of years, trying cannabis for the first time, because it's now, of course, a legalized substance in this country. And then finally, of those who reported that they do in fact use cannabis, about 18% reported daily use, and that number hasn't changed, interestingly. So although the age of initiation has gone up, the percent of individuals who use cannabis who are daily users has not changed in the last couple of decades. So that's kind of interesting that number seems to be relatively constant over time. And then the last thing I want to say on this question of who is using cannabis is there's a really interesting relationship between perceived harm and rate of cannabis use. And what this is telling us, and again, this is something that's been very consistent over many, many years. It's like people who perceive cannabis as very harmful have very low rates of cannabis use. And people that perceive cannabis as not at all harmful have very high rates of cannabis use. So this is very interesting to someone in my position because I teach about cannabis. And so I feel like I'm often sharing, objective scientific information on the potential harms and the potential benefits. And so I'm always have this graph in the back of my mind. It's like, I have to be very careful how that I don't stray away from the evidence and try to lean people in one direction or the other, because I know that the perception of harm is directly related to the rate of cannabis use. And so, so I'm always kind of conscious of that. So again, I think it's to recognize, it's really healthy rather to recognize that there is probably potential harms associated with cannabis use, and there's also probably potential benefits associated with cannabis use. And so maybe that perceived harm is somewhere in the middle, which would be associated with kind of a mediocre rate of cannabis use. Okay. So wait, I just skipped a slide, sorry. How does cannabis affect the body and your behavior? And so there's a couple of factors that we need to consider in order to answer that question. The first one is how are people getting this stuff into the body, right? How are they administering cannabis? And so again, the statistics here are relatively recent. Typically, cannabis is smoked. And so we would call that the route of administration is inhalation. They're inhaling this drug, whether that's rolling it up and smoking it as a joint or smoking it out of a bong. Those would both be considered methods of inhalation. And so if you are consuming cannabis through inhalation, about 50% of what you smoke is thought to enter the lungs. A lot of that you exhale and it never enters the lungs. And almost all of the drug that enters the lungs will enter the body. It's actually really efficient the lungs are very good at picking things out, absorbing them into the bloodstream, and then delivering those products straight to the brain. We see, asthma medication, for example, is delivered through inhalation for that specific reason, because it's very fast acting. It's very efficient way to get drugs into the body. And of course, asthma medications are typically working on the lungs anyway. So it's nice to get that drug right, to where it's supposed to be acting. So after inhalation, cannabis typically reaches the brain in about 30 seconds. So very fast onset of action. The effects of cannabis typically peak around 30 to 60 minutes. And again, that is specific to inhalation. That peak of drug effect would be very different if you were administering if you were consuming edible cannabis products, for example, or if you were administering THC through a transdermal patch. These numbers would change drastically. But for inhalation, the effects come on really, really quickly, within 30 seconds. And the peak effect is kind of that 30 to 60 minute range. You might see effects as long as 3 to 4 hours, depending on dose and your experience with cannabis, so on and so forth. Another reason why it's such a hard, kind of a similar question to the very first question we had, what is cannabis? It's what does cannabis do to the brain? That's kind of what we're answering now. Another reason that's such a difficult question to answer is because cannabis is distributed everywhere. And so it likes to hide away in fatty tissues. The more fat you have on your body, the more, THC, for example, can get sequestered in those fat cells and kind of camp out there for longer periods of time. And this stuff is distributed globally. So cannabis is affecting the brain. It's also affecting the peripheral nervous system. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple of slides. Of course, inhalation isn't the only, method of administration when it comes to cannabis. I mentioned a couple of others, but there's oral administration, right? Edible cannabis products. There's sublingual administration. I don't know really how popular those are, but these products are available. So there's like, basically liquids that you can put under your tongue and it absorbs, through the mucous membranes, for example. That would be another route of administration. And then I mentioned transdermal administration. So patches and creams, there's a lot of cannabis products that are used to help with like inflammation at joints or joint pain. And so in that case, you'd want to rub that that cream or whatever on the skin right at the site of where you want that drug to work. And that would be considered transdermal administration. So some of the psychological effects of cannabis, honestly, I could probably spend hours and hours and hours talking about this. So I almost feel like this slide is not going to do it justice. There's a lot of effects of cannabis. They're typically broken down into like cognitive, behavioral, or perceptual effects. And interestingly, so I do a lot of work actually kind of like going out and talking to individuals who are using cannabis and trying to understand like the reasons why they're using or their motivations for using cannabis. And it's really interesting that some people will say like they're using cannabis for the cognitive effects to like, decrease their attention or just kind of like disconnect maybe after a long, hard day or something like this, to alter their, their concentration, or, maybe they're trying to concentrate on different things or not concentrate at all, but they're kind of using cannabis to alter their cognitive processes. Behavioral effects are like decreased movement, increased talkativeness. Those are pretty stereotypical effects of cannabis. This decreased movement, we could also say like decreased coordination. There's a lot of really good evidence to show how cannabis affects things like reaction time. And this obviously matters in the conversation of like cannabis impaired driving. We did a study a couple of years ago where we went out and asked youth all over this country, like, what are some of the myths that you've heard? Like, what are some of your beliefs in cannabis? And they would say like, cannabis makes me a better driver because, I'm a little paranoid that I'm breaking the law. And so I drive slower and I'm a little bit more careful on the roads. Well, that was problematic because all of the scientific evidence points in the opposite direction, that cannabis reduces reaction time, kind of alters your decision-making in a way that makes you a more dangerous driver or worse driver. So I'm always interested in people that, mention that they use cannabis because, for some of these behavioral effects. Maybe sometimes they think it's doing one thing and it's doing the other, or they're kind of blinded by some of the effects of cannabis. And then, of course, I would say a lot of people are using cannabis for to alter their perception. So you get a lot of like musicians or artists, or even whatever art form you're interested in. People are consuming cannabis to kind of change their perception. Maybe they're hearing tunes or painting pictures a little bit differently under the influence of cannabis. And so they're very happy to use cannabis as a way to kind of alter their perception, and maybe they find benefit out of that in their profession. And then the subjective effects, these are more like psychological functional effects that we can measure and we can like study. The subjective effects are a little bit harder to study. So when we ask people like, how do you feel when you consume cannabis? They'll say like, we feel high or we feel intoxicated. And that's certainly a product of consuming the cannabis plant. And we actually think it's predominantly the THC. We talked about some of those compounds in the cannabis plant. It's probably the THC above all of the others that are causing these subjective feelings of being high or being intoxicated. So, okay, let's take a pause and just, I kind of want to relate this back to our program a little bit, right? This is supposed to be like a mock lecture or a pseudo, feel of what it would look like to be in a first year neuroscience course, for example. And so we have neuroscience programs. If you're a student in the neuroscience program, we do a lot of investigation on like how the brain works, like what are the nuts and bolts mechanisms of how the brain is operating and how these drugs get in there and change some of those nuts and bolts to alter, things like perception or behavior or cognition or whatever it is. So, how does cannabis produce these psychological changes is something that we're very interested in as neuroscientists, right? What are these compounds actually doing in the brain to produce these changes? And so very quickly, I'll introduce a neuron. A neuron is your kind of primary cell type in the brain. I have no idea if you're familiar with a neuron or not, so forgive me, but the neuron is considered like the functional unit of the brain. Your brain is able to like get work done, and different parts of your brain are able to communicate with each other and work, kind of collaboratively or cohesively with each other. And all of that is due to the presence of neurons. So these are cells that, process information and then send information to their neighbor, essentially. And if you're like a biology student, or if you're interested in biology, these neurons are very similar to all of the other cells in your body, and that they have what we call a soma. Soma is Latin for body. So it's kind of like the body of a cell. And this cell has like a nucleus and all of the organelles, like the mitochondria and the Golgi and all of the other, organelles that you're familiar with because they're present in all of the other cells. It's like a neuron has all of those components. There are a few special components that we see on neurons that we don't see on some of these other cells, around the human body. One of those parts is an axon. And then the other part is these things called axon terminals. And that's basically a way a neuron sends information to its neighbor. And that allows two neurons to communicate with each other. And so these neurons kind of like bud up to each other and form what are called neural networks. So this neuron is connected to this neuron, and that neuron is connected to the next neuron, and this neuron is connected over here. And so they form these vast networks, and they're basically just sharing information amongst each other. I mean, that's probably the easiest way, or the most simplified way I can boil down the function of a neuron. And okay, and so this is kind of a different image. So you have the soma of a neuron here, and it's like sprouting, it's aiming its axon at its neighbor, which is the cell over here. And these neurons bud up really, really closely to each other, but they never touch. So they come really close, but they don't physically touch each other. And if we kind of zoom up on this little area here, we can kind of see these two neurons like making contact. They don't make physical contact, but they get really, really close to each other. And at this is called the synaptic cleft, which is a really fancy way of saying like kind of the point of contact between two neurons. And at this point, they exchange chemicals. And those chemicals are like bits and pieces of information. And so one cell releases some chemicals that the other cell can read and understand the message that's trying to be transmitted. And almost all of the drugs that we know and love that are, recreational or medicinal, that are legal or illegal, almost all of the drugs out there are acting on this little blown up image here at the synapse, the point of contact between two neurons. And so again, going back to our question, like how does cannabis produce these psychological or behavioral effects? It's like, well, it does so by acting right at the level of the synapse and changing the way that two neurons communicate with each other. And so I'll try not to get too far into the weeds, into the nitty-gritty details here. But in order to understand, the specific effects of cannabis, we have to kind of introduce the receptors in the brain that the cannabis, the compounds in the cannabis plant, like THC and CBD and CBN, so on and so forth, they're all targeting a pair of receptors in the brain called cannabinoid receptors. And those cannabinoid receptors are denoted as CB1, the cannabinoid 1 receptor, or CB2, the cannabinoid 2 receptor. And so CB1 and CB2 receptors are located kind of everywhere, to be honest. CB1 receptors, I think there's an image on the next slide that'll give you kind of a visual look at where these receptors are in the human body. But a really easy way to sum it up is like they're everywhere. Okay, so these CB1 receptors are all over the brain. One of the most commonly expressed receptors in the human brain is the CB1 receptor. And the CB2 receptors are a little bit in the brain, but mostly in peripheral tissues of the immune system and things like that. And you might be wondering, like, why is there a receptor in the human brain and the human body that responds to these compounds that are like that we're finding in these plants that grow outside? And the answer to that is we have our own versions of these chemicals that we find in the cannabis plant. And those are called endocannabinoids. Endo means like comes from within. Cannabinoids means cannabinoids. So these endocannabinoids are like our own version of THC and CBD and CBN. And And so these are the endocannabinoids are what normally bind to the CB1 and the CB2 receptors. And that's a system that is natural, that every human being on this planet, has an endocannabinoid system. And so when you consume cannabis from, you're taking these compounds from the outside world and you're putting them into your body, it's like those compounds are just stimulating the receptors that the endocannabinoids normally stimulate. Okay. And if you're interested and what the endocannabinoids are, there's two of them that are, again, kind of the most famous, the most talked about, and those are called anandamide and 2-arachidinoyl glycerol, or 2-AG. And so your bodies produce and release anandamide and 2-AG very normally, and those compounds will bind to the CB1 and CB2 receptors to do their thing, to do their jobs. So again, cannabis and these compounds that are found in the cannabis plant, we, put them into our body through inhalation or through these, transdermal patches or whatever it is. And these compounds get, distributed around the body, and they bind to and they act on these receptors. So here's a great look at like, kind of a visual distribution of these cannabinoid receptors across the human brain and body. You can see the CB1 receptors are very concentrated in the brain, all the way up and down the spinal cord. So they have a really interesting role to play in like pain signaling and management of chronic pain, for example. And then we have the CB2 receptors that are like, in these peripheral tissues in the spleen and some immune cells. I don't know. I'm a little bit colorblind, and so I can't actually tell if this diagram is telling you that CB2 receptors are in the brain, but they are up there. There's not very many of them. They're mostly found in the periphery, but there are CB1 receptors in the periphery, and there's CB2 receptors in the brain. And so again, an easy way to sum it up is like, these receptors are everywhere. When you consume cannabis, you are affecting all of these receptors. And so again, going back to like, what are the effects of cannabis on the human brain and body? Well, that's a tough question to answer, because like cannabis is acting on all of these different locations. And if we look at the brain specifically, like, not that this narrows it down at all, but there are some major brain structures that have high levels of these cannabinoid receptors. So areas of like the basal ganglia, for example, that and the cerebellum, that are both involved in like motor movements and coordinating motor movements. There's a high levels of these cannabinoid receptors in there. And so when you're consuming cannabis, you're really affecting the function of these areas. And so again, some of the symptoms, some of the effects of this drug are like, deficits in motor movement and motor coordination and decreased reaction time. And that's all because, cannabis is getting up into these specific areas that control motor movement, for example. Okay, so what are the harms associated with cannabis use? This is a really interesting study, and it was published in 2017. And I actually think that I know that they repeat these studies every 5 to 7 years-ish. They take a lot of work and a lot of money to do. And so I expect that this study will be redone anytime now. So we might have a new look at like a 2023 version, but the latest information we have on the cost and harms of all substances, in Canada are as follows. And so you can see cannabis is right here. There are a significant amount of harms that cannabis causes to society. However, if you stack those harms up next to some of the other commonly available drugs in our country, like tobacco and alcohol and opioids, for example, then the harms of cannabis overall don't really look that bad. So they don't compare at all to the harms that, alcohol, the harms that alcohol causes or the harms that tobacco cause. Like, these drugs are far more harmful to Canadians compared to cannabis. And if you're wondering, what do I mean by harms? This is a really comprehensive study that looked at, cost to the healthcare system, cost to the criminal justice system, lost productivity in like the workplace, for example, and then other direct causes, car accidents or incarcerations or whatever it is. So it's like a really comprehensive look at harms. And again, just to put things into perspective, there's no denying that cannabis doesn't cause harms to society, but not nearly to the same extent that some of these other drugs cause harm to Canadians. So I think that's always kind of interesting, and maybe some of you wouldn't have guessed that, but that's what the data tells us. So I kind of forget why I put these graphs in, maybe just to show that let me back up one slide. So this study was done in 2017. That was 1 year pre-cannabis legalization. And so we know that the rates have changed post-legalization. And so we can expect that probably the harms to our country have changed as well. And so this is a look at rates of cannabis use in like 2013, 2015, and 2017, so the years leading up to cannabis legalization, and then looking at kind of 2018 and 2019 in this particular graph. And what we see here is that in some demographics, cannabis use went up, and in other demographics, cannabis use has actually gone down. So I don't really know where the chips are going to fall, like overall, how much has cannabis use changed in, the 5 years post legalization. But I think you'll find that in some age demographics, it's gone up, and in others, it's gone down. So it's probably in and around the same levels. I will be very interested to see how the changes in rates of use have affected things like, harms to the country, for example. How am I doing? Okay. Okay, so a couple of words on cannabis and mental health. This is particularly what I'm interested in terms of research. So again, if you're a neuroscience student and you're in the neuroscience program, you have myself and a couple of other faculty members in the department who are very interested in the effects of cannabis on mental health. Again, going back to like who is using cannabis, it's all of our, it's mostly like our students' age demographic. And so we have perfect access to do some research on these particular folks and try to better understand what patterns of use are associated with harms? What are the potential harms associated with cannabis use? What potential benefits are individuals consuming cannabis getting out of this? And so, trying to just better understand that relationship. And so, what have we learned as far as cannabis and mental health? Not much, to be honest. It's still very kind of blurry and not as clear cut as you might like. Oops, I keep accidentally switching slides. But a couple of things that we do know. So cannabis use during adolescence is associated with depression and suicidality in adulthood. And I want to be very clear, we don't know if this is a cause and effect relationship. It's like kind of like the chicken and the egg conversation. So we're not saying that cannabis use causes depression and suicidality in adulthood, but there is a pretty significant relationship between individuals who do use cannabis in these like kind of early adolescent years, and then the development of depression and suicidality or having suicidal ideations later on in their life. So there's a pretty significant relationship there. We just don't know the direction of that relationship. Are people with who will ultimately develop depression and perhaps suicidality later in adulthood, are they, predisposed to using cannabis use, or is it the other way around? So that's still an unanswered question. We do see a lot of changes in the distribution of these receptors that we've been talking about. The CB1 receptor in particular, that was the one that was in the brain and up and down the spinal cord. And so individuals who use cannabis chronically, especially during those kind of like adolescent, early adulthood years, do show kind of these long-term changes in CB1 distribution across the brain. Is that good? I don't know. Is that bad? I don't know. But what we do know is there seems to be a change. And a lot of this comes from, post-mortem studies, for example, where after people have passed away, we can kind of take out their brains. And if individuals had a history of cannabis use, it's like we see a very unique pattern of CB1 receptors versus if the individual had never been exposed to cannabis, just as an example. And then its relationship to anxiety is mixed. So this is a topic that is very popular these days. We get a lot of questions about the relationship between cannabis use and anxiety. One of my partners in crime, Dr. Kim Hellmans, and I, and Owen actually, who is here as well, did an Instagram live last week, I think, on this exact question. So maybe I'll shout out. We have an Instagram account. It's at CU Cannabis Crew. CU is in Carleton University, Cannabis Crew. And we're all about just sharing objective scientific information about cannabis and the effects of cannabis on the brain and behavior. And so Emily is very much involved in that work too, and Owen. And so if you're interested in this stuff, check out our Instagram account. I think we posted that Instagram live. So if you're interested in that question, does cannabis cause anxiety? There's a lot more information available there. But essentially, it's like it depends. It's complicated. Acutely, it seems that cannabis is actually going to reduce anxiety, but chronic use of cannabis seems to set somebody up for the development of anxiety later on. And so there's a lot of nuance in that conversation. So we just say, like, it depends. It depends on all these other factors. But again, if you're interested in that, head over to the @CU Cannabis Crew Instagram page, and there's some more information for you there. And again, changing my slides in the wrong direction. So moving forward. Okay. So, right. So this was a kind of one of a handful of landmark studies over the last couple of years looking at the prevalence of psychological distress amongst cannabis users versus non-cannabis users. And so level of psychological distress as high or very high. And so these people are reporting they are experiencing psychological distress, either high levels or very high levels. And there's kind of a clear relationship between individuals who also report using cannabis are much more likely to report high or very high levels of psychological distress versus individuals who did not report cannabis use. Again, no cause and effect relationship there. I'm not trying to say that cannabis leads to or causes psychological distress, but there is a very interesting relationship between cannabis use and psychological distress. And that's what I'm really interested in trying to like better understand that relationship so that we can, provide information, in part of like a harm reduction approach to allow people to use cannabis, but avoid some of these potential negative health consequences. Again, hard question to answer. Can cannabis use cause depression? Maybe it's really unclear. So when I say there's a relationship between cannabis use and depression, that's not saying cannabis use causes depression. That's a much harder question to answer. When we do look at longitudinal studies, and this is where we can follow individuals for like 10 or 20 years and really get a good understanding of like the effects of these drugs on things like depression. So in these longitudinal studies, individuals would show up with no depression at the beginning of the study. However, if they were cannabis users, they were 4 times more likely to have depression at the follow-up. So that's a year or 2 years down the road. And so that is, that's interesting to consider. And depression at baseline, so if individuals entered this longitudinal study with depression, it did not predict cannabis use disorder at that same follow-up. And so it's like, with those two pieces of information, it seems that maybe cannabis use is leading to or causing depression. It doesn't seem that depression is causing cannabis use. So again, there's a lot to unpack in that relationship, but it does seem that cannabis use might be leaning someone towards depression. It doesn't mean that if you use cannabis, you develop depression. It just means you are more likely to develop depression. So if something bad goes wrong, or you experience trauma, or life gets really hard, like during the pandemic was a great example of that, where for 2 years people were really struggling. It's like in those challenging situations, someone with a history of cannabis use might be more likely to develop depression as a result. Okay, can cannabis use cause psychosis? So another interesting relationship. There does seem to be some relationship between use of high THC products, particularly very early on in life, like at a very young age, and the development of psychosis later on. It is likely related to genes. In fact, we have a very good idea of specifically what genes are involved. Interestingly, it's like all these new companies like 23andMe, and I can't think of any of the other ones off the top of my head, but where you can just like spit in a tube and mail it to these people, and they'll give you they'll do a genetic analysis. And so we're almost at this point in time where like we can find out if we have these genes that confer risk, and make it more likely that if we use cannabis, we develop psychosis. It's like maybe we're close to being at a place where we can find out that information before we make a decision. Do we want to use cannabis? Yes or no? And that would be fantastic. So there does seem to be a very heavy genetic component in whatever risk there is for THC's ability to cause schizophrenia later on. Okay, so this one I know the answer to, and there's no getting around this one, unfortunately. Is cannabis addictive? Yes, it is. It meets all of the hallmarks of addiction as it's described in the DSM-5, which is like basically a manual that doctors use to diagnose patients with mental illnesses or mental health disorders. And so cannabis ticks off all of the boxes. It's very much an addictive substance. I'm not saying it's as addictive as, cocaine and the amphetamines or some of the opioid painkillers. But if we're just saying like, is cannabis addictive? Yes or no, it's 100% certain. Yes, it is. It does act on the brain in the exact same areas that a lot of the other addictive substances act, which is kind of like if you're a neuroscience nerd, that's like the dopamine pathways and the VTA and things like that. We know cannabis is acting in those areas. Chronic cannabis smoking, or I should say chronic cannabis consumption, leads to tolerance. This is a hallmark of an addictive drug. It's like if you drink one alcoholic beverage, a couple of weekends in a row, eventually you're going to need to drink 2 alcoholic beverages to get the same effect. Well, the same thing is happening with cannabis. So individuals do develop tolerance to it, which means they're likely to increase the amount of cannabis they use over time to achieve that same, behavioral or cognitive or perceptual effect that they were after. If you are using cannabis for long periods of time and stop, there are withdrawal symptoms, and the withdrawal symptoms aren't that extreme, to be honest. And they kind of present in different ways: muscle aches and pains, maybe some irritability. These are pretty common with withdrawal to addictive drugs. And so again, like other addictive drugs like alcohol, for example, or benzodiazepines have very potent and very serious and potentially harmful withdrawal symptoms. That doesn't happen with cannabis, but cannabis does have, if you use cannabis chronically for long periods of time and then just quit cannabis use altogether, you can expect to experience withdrawal symptoms. And again, that's a hallmark of an addictive substance. And then cannabis, individuals who use cannabis who do attempt to abstain will show relapses. Not all the time. And I'm not saying, that most individuals will relapse, but there's a lot of good data to show, like, if you stress an individual out, they'll just like revert back to consuming cannabis. And again, that's a hallmark of an addictive substance. If you look at the data, it says about 1 in 6 individuals who use cannabis will develop a cannabis use disorder. To be honest, that's like data from government surveys. Our data in our research program shows slightly lower numbers, about 1 in 10. So, still in the same ballpark, but so we'll, anywhere between 1 in 6 and 1 in 10 individuals who use cannabis will go on to develop a cannabis use disorder at some point in their life. So yes, with absolute certainty, cannabis is an addictive drug. Is legalization a good thing? I don't know. I guess we're here. Does it even matter if it's a good thing? Yes or anymore? I mean, I would say yes, it is a good thing. Again, my opinion doesn't really matter on this topic anymore. The decision was made. It's been legalized in our country for 5 years. I understand it's an interesting debate. I personally believe it was a very good idea. We know that prohibition of drugs doesn't work. We've seen it time and time again throughout history. Prohibition doesn't work. And so it's not an effective way to stop people from using whatever you're trying to prohibit. And so that was very true with cannabis. Prohibition didn't work. We knew that a large portion of our population was still using cannabis despite it was an illegal drug, and you could, potentially go to jail for having this stuff. And so, yeah, having it illegal didn't help anybody. It only marginalized individuals who use cannabis. There's all kinds of really good reasons why, legalization made sense, decriminalizing use so that people don't go to jail, for using this substance that clearly is not causing as much harm as like alcohol and tobacco, which are very legal and very accessible. Obviously, the government's going to profit off this endeavor, and I think that's a good thing. I suppose depending on what they spend the money on, that's a good thing. But we were promised money towards research to better understand the effects of cannabis, or money towards treatment options for that 1 in 10 people who do develop a cannabis use disorder, like to have treatment options available to them. And so if we can use the funds generated from the legalization of cannabis to pay for all of those things, to me, I think that's a fantastic situation. And then it allows us to educate and research and understand and provide awareness. Like, for 100 years, when this was like a scheduled illegal drug, it's like really hard to do research on it. And if you ask people about their history with cannabis use, they're probably going to lie to you, because why would they put their hand up and say, yeah, I use an illegal substance? And so it really created barriers to better understanding what this drug is all about, what are some of the potential benefits or pitfalls or potential harms. And it's like, so now we have an opportunity to understand that and learn that. And I think that's what the last 5 years and probably the next 5 or 10 years is going to be about, is better understanding all of the questions that I presented here that I don't have great answers to. So I think that's a good thing. One of the things that we're interested in our research program is like what patterns of cannabis use are associated with harm. We've kind of talked about like, yeah, cannabis, it could possibly cause harm, but it also could have benefit. And so what patterns of cannabis use are associated with harm versus associated with potential benefits? And so that's, kind of one of the questions that we ask in our research lab. And so, on this topic of like red flags for use, I would say like a family history of psychiatric illness, particularly depression and anxiety, because those are the ones that we think, or that are like talked about, that have the strongest relationship with cannabis use, I would say. So if you have a family history of psychiatric illnesses, of schizophrenia or depression, anxiety, it's like you might have the genetics that predispose you for some of the negative consequences of cannabis use. Maybe you want to consider your use if you're one of those individuals. If you have a current psychiatric illness, cannabis is probably going to do more harm than good for you. If you have a lifetime history of trauma, for example, if you experienced early childhood trauma or some adverse childhood experiences, typically in our research, the people that have experienced trauma early on, who then start using cannabis as a young adult, are the ones that experience some of the more negative consequences of cannabis use. And then using alone or using cannabis to cope with some issues. You're using cannabis to cope with anxiety or to cope with stress. It's like that is typically some of the I guess more risky behaviors associated with cannabis use. And so when we ask people or when people tell us we're using cannabis to cope with stress, and then we talk to that person or we see that person again in a research study in 10 months or a year, it's like those are the people that are more likely to have experienced harm or developed some depression or anxiety or something like that. So those would be like my red flags for use. Yeah, so I don't even know if I want to get into this. I feel like I've been talking for forever. But we had a really interesting couple of years, right, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID did seem to impact, sorry, did I say that backwards? COVID seemed to impact cannabis use. I was going to say cannabis use impacted COVID, but I don't think that was true. About 53% of people reported about the same amount of cannabis use throughout the pandemic. And I should source this. This was from a government survey that was administered last year in 2022. And so kind of like at the tail end of the pandemic. And so they're suggesting that like the majority, over half of the people who use cannabis didn't change their cannabis use during the pandemic. That's fantastic, right? However, 24% reported that they increased their use. And so it's like that 24% is probably where we need to pay most attention to and try to understand are those people at risk of experiencing harm? I suppose on the bright side, 23% reported a decreased use. And so that, is probably a good thing too. So what were the impacts of COVID-19 on cannabis use? For most people, probably not a huge impact, but there's a certain, a quarter, 24% of that population seem to have increased their use during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that is something that we'll see how that plays out. I don't know. I put some pictures. So we did a lot of work trying to better understand the impacts of COVID-19 on substance use and mental health across the board. And so I know for other substances like opioids, for example, we saw a huge spike in opioid-related harms during the pandemic. Thankfully, it doesn't look like the same spike in cannabis-related harm is going to surface, but I suppose we shall see in the next couple of years. So thank you very much for your attention and your patience. I appreciate all of your time, and I'm happy to stick around for questions if there are any. Again, you can put them in the chat. You can take yourself off mute, whatever is easiest for you. Maybe I'll pass it back to you, Caitlin.
Yeah, thanks so much. Even as a non-science grad from Carleton, I found that really interesting. If you do have questions, I mean, you've got access to great people now. If you have questions about the program, what's life like as a student, Owen and Emily are students in the program, we'd love to take those so that you can get the answers that you're looking for, whether or not you've made a decision or still waiting to make a decision as to what the fall looks like for you. We'd love to be here to help answer those questions. So yeah, if you want to raise your hand, unmute, or use the chat, all of those options are available to you, whether those are about the program, about student life, or anything else that might be on your mind. If you don't have any questions, wow, you really did learn a lot. You can always reach out to us if questions come to you after this. That's always what happens to me. I leave a meeting and then it comes to me. You can reach out to admissions@carleton.ca if you have any questions about admissions or Carleton, or neuroscience@carleton.ca if you have questions specifically about neuroscience that can be answered by the experts from the program. So definitely don't be afraid to reach out if there's anything that we can do for you. If you're looking for more opportunities to engage, again, following Carleton Neuroscience on social media is a great way to get updates. You can also come to campus. We have lots of upcoming events, including our spring open house on Saturday, May 13th. You can check out information on our website for that, as well as campus tours that run just about every day of the week. So if you haven't made it to campus yet and you're looking for an opportunity to check out Carleton, I really do encourage you to register for a campus tour. It's a great way to get a glimpse into what this can look like for you. And if you'd like to chat with anyone from neuroscience while you're here, send us an email and we'll do our best to get you connected with that information. I'm keeping an eye on the chat and on hands to see if there's anything from folks that are here tonight. If you do have questions, definitely let us know. If you don't, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much, Zach, for all of that great information. I think that's a great glimpse for students into what a not even a first year class, but a neuroscience class can look like.